And then welcome to our final shiur as part of our Elul series. I'm going to begin, as we always do, singing a nigun, and then I'll introduce our teacher tonight, and we'll jump into what I know is going to be a really, really interesting and engaging final shiur in preparation for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I'm going to sing the melody from the text that we studied as part of our first session together from the Achat Sha'alti. Nai 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 na 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 nai 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 na nai na nai 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 na nai 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 na 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 nai 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 na na nai 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 na 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 nai 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 na nai na na nai 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 na nai na nai nai na na nai 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 na na nai nai nai. I want to say a word of introduction about our teacher tonight. Okay, maybe I want to say more than one word. Oh my goodness, I had even written it out. I did, Rachel. I wrote it out and I have to find it. Give me one moment. I am very excited to introduce Rachel Brody to you all. We have shared Rachel's bio with you, so if you read it, you would know that Rachel is a Jewish educator who works primarily with adult learners and who specializes in creating professional development opportunities for other Jewish educators as well. And in 2019 was appointed to be the senior educator at the Jewish Studio Project. Earlier, Rachel served as the Chief Jewish Officer, which is an incredibly creative and interesting position at the JCC of San Francisco. And before that, she co-founded and directed a not-for-profit called Jewish Milestones, which was an ingenious way of putting in the hands of people who are not formally connected to Jewish communities or to Jewish communal professionals the resources that they need in order to be able to celebrate their life cycle ceremonies. I want to share, most of all, that my friendship with Rachel goes back to my days at JTS over 30 years ago when she was in graduate school and I was in rabbinical school. Our similar backgrounds and interests and a shared approach to study that fuses reverence for the text with a healthy dose of irreverence for authority is what brought us together and has kept us bound all these years. Rachel and I have written and published together. We've authored more books in our minds than we can count. We've designed curricula and outlines of plans for other books and other projects. Most exciting is the reimagining that we've done together of Jewish life, of Jewish identity, and of Jewish possibility. To me, Rachel has been my trusted editor of sermons and articles. She spares no criticism, and though she's made me cry a few times, I have learned to love and to cherish when she plays that role. She not only polishes my writing, though. Rachel encourages my thinking, she challenges my ideas, she forces me to take accountability, intellectual and spiritual, for my positions. And she's wickedly funny to boot. And though she's not a rabbi by training, Rachel is my Rebbe. I am so proud to introduce her to Sha'ar and to join you all in learning with her tonight. Rachel, welcome.
Wow. Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's a little bit of pressure, but I'll do the best I can. It's really lovely to be here. This is one of the great things about this the silver lining in the pandemic is the ability to participate in the lives of my friends and their communities that are across the continent and around the world. And just the idea that I could be participating in this without having to actually go through Newark Airport is very exciting to me. So I'm really glad to be here. And I actually even recognize some familiar faces, which is lovely. So I can tell you the thing I'm most excited about is that because I'm dealing with mostly New Yorkers, I assume, I can talk really fast, which I've been in California for 25 years and people don't understand a thing I'm saying, but the truth is they really could. They just don't think they can. But I've slowed down considerably and it's terrible. So for you guys, I'm going to talk at about this rate. How's that? Is that good? You're like looking at me like deer in headlights, but honestly, it's very hard to speak this slowly, but I've gotten better at it. So I'm very excited to be able to deal with New Yorkers and to be able to do a little bit of pre-high holiday thinking. So because there are a bunch, as Dini said, I'm going high tech, because there are a whole bunch of different pieces to this presentation, I've asked Dini to actually do the screen share for the slide so that I can have my hands free to do other entertaining things. So I am going to ask Nini to start with the screen share of the first slide.
Oh my goodness, right away.
Okay. Right. Keep you on your toes, Dini. I hope you don't cry from this. I'm usually harsher. This is, so basically what I want to do is just give you a very quick sense of what the bigger plan is. I find adults like to not be surprised by 90 minutes of their time, and that just sort of knowing what the plan is might be helpful. So I'll just say that we're going to start off talking about something called soundscapes, which we'll define and talk about as connected specifically to the shofar. And then we're going to study a text together. It's a text from the Talmud. It is one of the most, it's just a beautiful 3-line literary unit. It just is like this little gem. And it has to do with speech and silence. So we'll spend most of our time doing that, and then we'll discuss it at the end. And that is really and truly it. So first slide, here it comes. The other thing is that oh no, that's not the first slide. You're giving them hold on, spoiler alert, this is coming up, it's the verse, oh no.
I'm sorry.
Back. That's the first one, okay, that's great. We often battle for control. This is gonna be interesting. You should know that Dini is one of my favorite people on the planet. So it's actually a lot of fun. I see her mom here. I've got, the connection to the family is awesome and long. This is the topic. What I will say is I know that in different sessions for this group that sometimes you use the chat, you don't use the chat. I don't mean talking to each other. I think passing notes is fine. But I meant sometimes I may ask you if you have a response, just so we can hear more voices, if you type your answer into the chat, and we can that way look at a bunch of answers at the same time. Because with this many people, it sometimes is hard to have more than a few voices, and I would love to hear from more of you. Also, you can just take yourself off mute if there's something you want to say. You don't have to, you can sort of just get my attention, and but you don't have to use that little blue hand thing. And I may ask people to read, and so if you just sort of hold up your hand volunteering, I will be happy to call on you. Any questions before we start? Great, let's get started. Dini, next slide.
Okay, I'm coming. Help. There we go.
Excellent. Okay. So this is a concept I learned about from the place where truth in California comes from, which is NPR. And it's something called a soundscape. And I learned about it many years ago, and I was sort of fascinated by the concept. So the first slide is actually a quote about the idea of soundscapes. Would anybody like to volunteer to just read that out loud for us? Otherwise, I'm gonna have to call on Betty. This could be a very hard night for you, Betty. Somebody, anybody? Actually, because I can't even see everybody. Somebody, please, just read. It's not hard.
Okay, you want me to read? Go.
Yes, please.
Okay. Sound, when understood as an environment, is a soundscape, a powerful tool that helps humans relate to their surroundings. They can be consciously designed by an individual or group of individuals, or the byproduct of historical, political, and cultural circumstances. They may be musical compositions, ethnographic, anthropological, field recordings of a rainforest taken by an ecologist, or imaginings of a sound designer, historian, ruminating upon the sounds of the past.
Thank you. So this is what a soundscape is. It's really just the environment as understood through sound. And it has a lot of uses, as Betty just read, but there is actually a lot that has to do with, that's used by primarily, from what I can tell, by ecologists to understand the actual health of a natural habitat. Would somebody be willing to read that second paragraph? Oh, no, Wendy was just fixing her hair. Do you think you could read also? Thank you so much. There's a little bit of a trick there. Fake out.
I'll
Great.
read. In the wild, sound is a matter of life and death. Birds, insects, mammals, and amphibians rely on complex communication networks to live and reproduce. In habitats where wildlife vocalizations signify mating calls, danger from predators, or territorial claims, hearing these sounds is essential to animal survival. That is why soundscapes, acoustic environments, are so important for defining the health of natural habitats.
Thank you. So just the idea that it can be a matter of life and death is something that's intriguing to me, as that's obviously a huge theme of the high holidays, but in what way could sound be a matter of life and death for us? So first I want to actually, Dina, if you don't mind, you could stop screen sharing for a moment. I am gonna play you. So one of the things that's been exciting is that the Smithsonian, among other places, have started collections of sounds from all over the world. And they seemingly are very random, but they're interesting. So I'm gonna play you 3 different snippets of sound, but I'm gonna do them one at a time, and I'm gonna see if you can guess what it is, okay? This is like a guessing game. Hold on. Okay, so here is your first one. Okay, you need to do that. Nancy, you have a guess? Oh, you have to take yourself off mute.
Unmute. I don't know what it's called, but it's in tribal. It's the long thing with beads.
Oh, the rain stick.
That.
Fascinating. Here's the thing. It does sound like one, but actually, what if I told you, here we're gonna get one step closer. This is actually a sound coming from 125th Street in Manhattan, or 132nd Street in Manhattan. It sounds like water. It does, like rain. Listen again, listen just carefully and see if you could really, if that sound says anything to you. This may be hard, I don't know.
Oh, water down a sewer.
Wait, what'd you say?
Water running down into a sewer.
Again, that's what it sounded like to me. I totally agree. Anybody else want to guess? It's not water. Leonard, go ahead.
Not water?
Nope.
I'm wrong. I was going to say fire hydrant.
I can tell you, all these things are reasonable. You want to know what it is?
Wait, it sounded to me
like
I heard the wheels of a car going over like the top of a what's it called on the street. Like I heard the
very
bump.
close. Very close. Oh, yes, we have a guess. Joyce. Oh,
Hi.
Joyce.
So I think, yeah, you know me.
I'm like, this is surprising.
My old neighborhood, the subway.
Nope. You can understand. These are all great guesses. Anybody else before I reveal? This is right where Fairway of Harlem, Alava Shalom, that is the sound of shopping carts. Just listen again.
Oh, going down the escalator.
No, they're collecting the shopping carts.
Oh.
Now that you know what it is, does it make sense to you or still not? Give me a thumbs up if it now makes more sense, or if you're going to insist it's water. Oh, look at that. Nobody's buying this one. Okay, interesting. Let's try another one. I have one for you that is, okay, how about if this one, we start with the fact that this is in Manhattan. Okay, this is in Manhattan, and this may surprise you. It's not what I think of as Manhattan, even back in the 70s. Hold on. No, here it is. Yeah, okay. Anybody want to guess? Where might you hear that combination of sounds? In the middle of Manhattan. Oh, Leonard, go ahead.
Central Park West.
Yep. This is actually in the middle of Central Park on a Saturday afternoon, apparently. That is what, on this particular day in June of 2019, this is what it sounded like.
Yeah, I heard the birds.
Occasionally a bird. I'm going to give you one last one. This one's tricky. This is not in America. I don't really think I need to say that once you hear it, but hold on. Wow, there's a lot with the same title. Hold on. Yeah. Do I need to get to the part where they kilo tout labriut? Do I have to get to that part? Do you know where this is? Can you recognize the sounds of a market in Jerusalem if you've ever been there? This is Machane Yehuda. And they do at one point have in the recording somebody yelling kilo tout labriut, which means a kilo of strawberries for your health, which is one of the most random and hilarious things. So I know these are not impressive displays. They have some that are impressive, but these are the kind of truly mundane sounds at random times, at random places, all over the world, actually. I mean, I was quite selective. I did look for something in Gloucester, New Jersey, and they have apparently not been recording Deanie and Andy. But the closest I found was Newark International, and I gotta say, I was not playing that. It gave me a headache just listening to it. It was like, well, so-and-so, come to the, I'm just like, oh my God. So these are soundscapes. And as Betty read at the beginning, that this is what is used by all kinds of everything from anthropologists to field ecologists to people who are just trying to understand the acoustic environment. So, Dina, if you don't mind the next slide. There are two other things I want to talk about regarding soundscapes. And one of them is the idea that during the pandemic, how many of you saw these striking photos of places that are normally packed with people completely empty, like the Piazza San Marco, or seeing Times Square, or seeing, did any of you see those pictures from either from drones or from the New York Times? I don't know. Show me your hands if you saw them. They're really quite striking. Okay, so I'm gonna do a little follow-up with Deanie. If you're interested, I'll send a link with it, because they're actually extraordinary, like places that are never, ever 24/7, 365 days a year empty. But that is true also for sound. There has been a remarkable change in the soundscape, less so now as people in America at least are coming out of their shelter in place. But those early weeks, especially the first two, there were remarkable descriptions of things people heard that they had never, ever heard. So would somebody read the paragraph on the left about during the pandemic? Okay, I'm gonna pick on the people I know, Andy. Do you think you could read the left side?
I can.
Thank you.
During the pandemic, the Cities in Memory Project has collected field recordings from around the world for the past 5 years, and this week launched a new campaign to build a global crowdsourced sound map, which shows how our oral lives are shifting as lockdown affects the world and urban environments evolve. Stay home sounds. Stuart Folks, who runs a project which has had contributions from 70 countries, says the outbreak and subsequent lockdown has transformed the way cities sound in the matter of a few days. This is a really unique time when the world is sounding like it's never sounded before, he said. In none of our lifetimes has the world ever sounded like it does right now.
Thank you. It's really remarkable. And there are these collections, and these were sent in by anybody. You still can, it's going on. You can always send in sound. One of the ones that I found most poignant, because I did listen to a bunch of them, was a grandmother in Helsinki who is separated from the rest of her family, her grandchildren, and I think her daughter, and can't get to them. And so you hear her reading Roald Dahl's Big Friendly Giant in I don't know what language. I think she was was I was thinking, and I don't remember actually, but in a language I definitely didn't understand. And she's reading it so animatedly. It actually could have been, you actually could even have guessed where it was in the story if you knew it, just based on how she was describing it. But she's basically reading to them over Zoom and, just trying to stay connected, as I'm sure many of us have tried to do in different ways. But it was just very poignant. And then, of course, you hear the sounds both outside and inside. And anyway, just a really interesting variety. So all of this got me thinking about the soundscape of the high holidays. And okay, so here we go. We're going to do this. There isn't a lot more reading to be done. So if somebody else that I want to volunteer, Sandy Browarski, might read you guys are like, if we know Rachel, we're getting off right now. Synagogue high holidays. What's the typical soundscape?
If we were to take a soundscape of a typical high holiday service, we would probably hear a few mating calls and the occasional cough. But apart from the Amidah, the silent standing prayer, we would hear words, words, and more words, sung and spoken, chanted and mumbled. It is the sounding of the shofar that radically alters this environment. It is what makes the soundscape of the high holidays unique. And it is precisely the experience of an altered soundscape that gives this time its visceral kedusha, a distinctive and elevated state.
Thank you very much. So really thinking about what is the soundscape of high holidays. And I am really, especially for people who go to synagogue first, and then who go to synagogue where instruments aren't used, the bombardment of words can, especially if they're long services, can really be a lot. Even beautiful words, even great dress show, whatever they are, it's a lot of words. And there is this famous story, which I'm telling you is not urban legend. I heard it from David Wolpe, so let's just say that's as close to NPR as we get out here. He tells a story how Elie Wiesel was once asked by an interviewer if there is a tradition of silence in Judaism. And he paused and he said, yes, there is, but we don't talk about it. I was just like, wow, Elie Wiesel with a sense of humor. That's awesome. But the truth is, silence is not a huge part of, in general, we seem to think of ourselves as a loquacious group of people, often talking over each other, etc. Certainly there are exceptions, but there is a lot of talking. And so I was trying to think of how distinctive is the shofar. It is so different than anything else. And one of the things that was striking to me is that this year on Rosh Hashanah, some people will hear the shofar. There have been many interesting discussions about the choice to blow shofar in this completely strange year, and the opportunity for people to hear it. But there are places that will still observe the traditional custom of, if on Shabbat you don't blow the shofar. And we're going to look at how that is approached, and we'll start by talking about the shofar itself. So Dini, if you don't mind. So let's start with the bracha for blowing shofar. It's actually interesting for what it isn't as much as what it is. So the bracha is the formula of Baruch Atah, and then it says lishmoa kol shofar. So in English, I purposely left that as blank, to blank the sound of the shofar. Now, many people may be familiar with the word lishmoa because it's the word shema, like Shema Yisrael. One of the challenges of working in English translation is that it actually forces the hand of the translator to make choices about words. And so is it to listen to the sound of the shofar? Is it to hear the sound of the shofar? What is it? So it is specifically not these other words. So I have, on the bottom, it's specifically, wow, I think I need glasses. It is specifically, that is amazing. Hold on. Oh, it is specifically not a different word for the word listen, which is laha'azin, like ha'azinu. It means, listen. What's interesting is it actually shares the root of the word for weights, for a balance, a scale. And as I actually 2 years ago had a slight, I don't know what it was, it's not vertigo, but it's this little thing where you lose your sense of balance. It's an ear thing. And I thought that is an amazing thing, that the word for ear, ozen, and the word for hearing is laha'azin. And it made me think of the idea that they're about balance and the ear and listening. It suddenly struck me as such an interesting connection about this idea of balance and hearing. But in any case, that's not the word we use. The second thing it's not is lahashmiya, which would be more a bracha about the sound, have the shofar sounded, or make the sound of the shofar, not that. And it's also, and this is the most interesting one, is it is never linagen, play the shofar. So the shofar has a funny status as, well, I guess for many people do understand that it is not really a musical instrument, although sound comes out of it. And I have a friend out here who actually every year runs a name that tune on the shofar, and actually he's a tuba player in real life, and he actually plays like Broadway musical songs, and it's crazy. They really do sound like it. But most people just do the typical, you know, tekiah, shvarim, trua. And it's not treated as a musical instrument. It's something else. So what is it? What actually are we supposed to be doing and getting from it? Dini, do you mind going to the next slide? So in this next slide, we're going to look just briefly at the difference between hearing, listening, and this word lishmoa. Wow, I feel like I'm afraid to ask someone to read, but you really don't want to hear my voice the whole time. Let's call on someone else. Joyce, why don't you read? Oh, are you in the sunset? I love these virtual backgrounds. You're all so confusing. Where is everybody?
Yeah, I'm not a good reader here.
You're not a good reader. Okay, great. Passing is always accepted. Somebody, please step up. It's good for the Jews. Come on. Oh my God, you're really gonna make me do this. Okay, hold on. Oh, thank you, Manette. Thank you. Okay. Excellent.
Hearing is to perceive sound, passive, versus listen, which involves attention to that sound, active, like the difference between vision and sight. Lishmoa is something greater than the sum of those two concepts. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks describes the Hebrew word shema as fundamentally untranslatable into English, since it means to hear, to listen, to pay attention, to understand, to internalize, to respond, to obey.
Thank you. It's a combination of things. That is a hard word to translate when you look at all of those synonyms that actually have very different meanings, related but different. So when we're saying, it's a little bit like a bracha itself. When you use that formula, the beginning of Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, that is so jam-packed with a variety of theological concepts. It's shorthand for some of the most profound understandings of what Judaism is trying to achieve in the world. In the same way, some of the other halves of the bracha, something like lishmoa kol shofar, is actually saying a whole lot of things. So if you look at that list of how Jonathan Sacks, yeah, I had to look that up because I always say like Lord, Doctor, Reverend, the very holy, he has great titles. He is also a spectacular, he's one of the first sources I go to when I prepare teaching. He is just wonderful. And I am actually gonna send, again, in some follow-up stuff, for your pleasure, if you would like, is an article he wrote called it's actually a drash, called The Spirituality of Listening. And it is just beautiful. It's really mostly about the Shema, but this is where he expands on the concepts that I've quoted here. So this idea of the active engagement, the sort of that it's essentially when you listen, it's intentional. And one of the striking things about a shofar is that there are all these halachot, all these rules, that if you walk by a window and you happen to hear a shofar blowing, if you didn't intend to hear it, it doesn't count. There's something about intentionality and shofar that is absolutely interconnected. It's not just that it happens. It's almost like a bracha for food, where if you then don't eat it, it's a wasted bracha. There's something about hearing this. Similarly, they say that if you hear the echo of a shofar, it also doesn't count. You have to hear the shofar, which is one of the things that's been particularly interestingly challenging for a lot of halachically following rabbis this year is Zoom an echo, or is it not? So again, just the myriad, I've learned that there are more than 600 new halachot that have been written since the beginning of the pandemic, which I think is its own pandemic in some ways. That's a lot of stuff generated. But all these interesting questions have come up. So listening actually requires us to be actively engaged and intentional. And something else happens, which, Dini, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Great. So this is what is also very strange and interesting. there are a lot of things that when it falls on Shabbat, you just don't do, but you don't remind yourself you're not doing it. So something else, let's say, even on Rosh Hashanah, there's certain prayers there are things you don't do because it's Shabbat, but nobody says, oh yeah, this is a day that we're going to remember that we don't say this prayer. Seems a little odd, but we actually call a day, when it's Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah, it has its own name. It's called Yom Zichron Tru'ah, a day of remembering the sound of the shofar, remembering the sound of a shofar. So I promise this is the last experiment, but I want you to if I were in California, I would tell you to close your eyes. Because you're in New York, you're gonna wonder if I'm gonna take your purse, but I'm on Zoom and you don't have to worry. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes for a minute, that would be great. If you don't bother, it'll still work. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to imagine two different sounds. I'm gonna say the sound and I want you to let your mind create that sound in your head if you can. One of them is the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones or cement. Clip-clop. The other is the sound of a door slamming, either in your own home or your home growing up. Actually, it could be any door slamming. You don't even have to be the sound of a slamming door. Okay, you can open up your eyes, check your surroundings. I've taken no valuables, and I'd like to see a show of hands. Were you able to hear those sounds in your head? Yeah. So this is a term I just learned, but it's a really interesting one, which is called audiation. It's about the memory of a sound, right? Think about like ideation, about ideas. This is audiation. It's about an imaginary sound, or sound that you imagine, but you can conjure sound in your own head, even though you're not hearing it in that moment. And I thought this is what a big piece of Yom Zichron Tru'ah is really about, which is how, first of all, we're gonna ask, well, still, why do it? But what an interesting idea, that the idea that you can have a sound described or you can be reminded of it, and at the same time, you can have sort of responses to it, including emotional responses to the memory of a sound. You can have memories actually triggered. You can hear music, you can hear language. One of the things that was so poignant to me, and actually a few of you knew her, my mom, I kept her voice on she'd left a message before she died, and I mean, one of many, and I kept it because I kept worrying I wouldn't remember the sound of her voice. And at some point it did get erased. I didn't do it on purpose, but it did. And I kind of tortured myself for a while, being like, I can't remember the sound of her voice. I can't remember it. And I'd try to conjure it. And then my brother said, she sounds just like you. I was like, oh yeah, I could just talk to myself. We did have a very similar voice. But the other thing about that is there is a sort of a powerful series of experiments, if you've seen Oliver Sacks's work or other kinds of sort of scientific studies of auditory phenomenon, like what actually is going on inside your brain, neurologically and otherwise, when sounds are stimulated, whether they're described or they are actually played for you. One thing that I actually later discovered a cassette tape of my mom telling some very funny stories from her apartment in New York. And I was driving. The only place I still had a cassette player was my car. So I was driving and playing it, and I pulled over because I heard a siren. It was on the tape. It was Manhattan siren from the 10th floor. It was so loud on the cassette that I actually thought it was behind me. And I just pulled off to the side of the road, waiting for whatever ambulance or fire truck it was. It was not in my house. It was not in my car. It was very interesting, though, that the sounds of New York to me are still very, I hear sirens, and I do, like many sirens, I still do think of New York. I also think of the sound of rain on an air conditioner as a very New York, that sort of little popcorn sound. Again, it's just associative of what memories and what it brings back, or Mr. Softy's horrible music from the ice cream truck on Shabbat afternoon all summer. You know, just these odd, I'm sure all of you have sort of odd little fragments of things that remind you of other times, but you know, you could replay that song in your head for a very long time. So if this is in fact part of what we're doing, and it does have these other associations, memories, emotions associated with it, what is the purpose of actually having a Yom Zichron Tru'ah? If we're not going to blow it, we're not going to blow it. We'll blow it the next day. If we're not going to blow it, okay, Shabbat is full of things that we normally do that we don't do, and that's part of what makes it distinctive. But anybody have any ideas? So there's no right answer, but ideas about what is the significance of having a day to remember a sound that you don't hear? I won't call on you, so only if you have something to say, but I hope somebody does. You can just take yourself on mute and share.
It's anticipatory. So there's a way in which it gets you ready and eager to hear it when you will hear it.
Lovely. So it's almost like a trailer. Like, like, I'll tell you what's coming up soon. You're going to want to hear it. Lovely. I think that's a great idea. That's a great idea. Other ideas? Somebody else? Why would we have this? How else could it function?
Maybe it functions in part to train us to be able to carry the sound beyond the day on which we blow it, so that we can continue to hear its commanding voice, even when it's not auditorily present.
Lovely. How else would we continue that? Have you ever found yourself thinking of the sound of a shofar beyond Yom Kippur? Or
do I eat matzah after Pesach? But isn't that the point also, though? I probably haven't, but oops.
Should we be thinking? It's a question. Is there something about what the shofar calls out in us or brings out in us that would be worth actually revisiting it between Yom Kippur and the beginning of the month of Elul?
I also think that sometimes our imagination is stronger than reality. Like when you read a book and you picture it, it's more vivid than when you see a movie that's been made of it. So maybe that's part of it.
Lovely. That's really lovely. I think that certainly could be. Oh, you know what? I see that there are things coming up in the chat. So let's see if, would it be like an echo of death, since we are symbolically preparing the possibility of death, yet finding a way to remember life on the verge of death? That's beautiful. That's a really beautiful idea. It's interesting, like how much do we really, for many of us, it's hard to go into this space of contemplating our own mortality and our own actions in this world. And while I feel grateful for the high holidays, I'm also usually grateful when they're over. I love Sukkot. I love Sukkot for a lot of reasons, but part of it is, for me, it's just relief. I'm like, okay, let's re-enter life and joy and, even the ephemerality of it, which is what Sukkot so much represents, our vulnerability. Nothing is permanent. I'm okay with that. But there is something about death that is definitely brought up. And do we really want to hear that all year round? And maybe we should. I don't know. It's a really good question. There's another comment also about how elemental it feels. That maybe not so much the sound of death, but the sound of creation or the sound of breath. And again, the value of reminding ourselves, or finding many ways, to remind ourselves about these other core concepts. These are, again, there's no right answer. These are just wonderful suggestions, because it is a curious idea. Anybody else before we move on a bit?
Yeah, I'll give you one before you move on.
Yeah.
So this came from a high holiday service I went to once, where they kept talking about awake, like for the sound of the shofar to, being like a call to be awake.
Yep.
And, especially these days, I don't mean COVID days, but I mean, in the last whatever number of years, where the whole idea of mindfulness has become, such a big focal point. This idea that, you should always try to be awake. It shouldn't be, just during the high holidays or Elul, but you should always try to be awake and be present.
Yep. Lovely. It's a it's I mean, the most famous person who sort of brought this idea that the shofar is an alarm clock essentially was Maimonides, who said the shofar is busy screaming at you, wake up from your slumber, wake up. And the slumber is, you know, definitely metaphorical. What are we not awake to? You know, what do we actually need this sound, not words, just sound, pure sound, to go through us and make something awake and alive, and as you said, mindful again. So these are all, you know, really interesting ideas about what this could mean, that we'd want to remember something when we don't actually hear it. But we're going to look at a text in a minute, but I would love it if you would keep in mind the idea that there are sometimes things that were said that are not repeated or can't be repeated, or whoever said it is no longer in your life, but that stay with you. You can actually hear those words in your head. Sometimes they are words of praise, and mostly they are not. And again, I'm happy to find out otherwise. Really, it's not, you know, it's not universal, but there are a lot of people who can remember something cruel that was said to them, whether it's something, a teacher who said to them, you know, you're an idiot, you'll never do math. Someone said that to me, which they were right about. I'm not an idiot, but I'm not great at math, but it certainly didn't encourage me to keep going with math. I was like, right, I'm not good at math. And I kept hearing that. And I can picture her clearly, the teacher who said that so many years ago, but it actually still reverberates, that sound, even though I can't hear her say it, I can hear her say it inside of me. And that's true for all kinds of things. It might be an insult to your appearance. It might be, you know, I hope that that's a concept that resonates, because I think there's something there about what it means over these high holidays, not just to think about, usually when people focus on silence or speech, it's about gossip and lashon hara, you know, different kinds of lashon hara, being more conscious of our communication. And believe me, that is always useful. But I'm wondering also about the things that aren't said, or the things that were said and just sort of stay and allow us to simmer in them, you know, resentments, disappointments, humiliations. And what happens when that becomes sort of a toxic sludge inside of us? So we're going to look at this like lovely little, as I said, a gem of a piece of Talmud. It's 3 lines long, and it's a complete story, and it's set up beautifully. And anyway, it's one of my favorites. It's poignant and borderline tragic, so prepare yourself. But it is, I think, an extremely powerful story for the topic that we're talking about. So what we're going to do is, Dina's going to go to the next slide. You're doing great. And I parsed the text into lines, specific lines, so that we could take it a little bit at a time. So let's start with this is the first line of it, or it's half of the first line actually. And this introduces our characters. So we have Rav Shimi and we have Rav Papa. Gotta say that I will never cease to laugh every time I say Rav Papa. There's something just funny about that. Anyway, the 2 rabbis were 4th century scholars, both of them. And Rav Papa was a disciple of the sort of I guess that sounds like Ur Kasdim. No, like this, the first real efforts at creating a canon and an academy of around rabbinic literature, Abaye and Rava. And Rav Papa himself was a disciple of them. I tell you this because you should know he was no slouch, okay? This is like this is like, on the East Coast, all right, West Coast, we say he's like somebody who teaches at Stanford. But honestly, it's more like someone who teaches at Harvard, because, you know, Stanford is just the Harvard of the West. But I really don't like perpetuating those elitist standards. So let's just say it's clear the guy is like a first-rate scholar, okay? It's important to keep that in mind. Okay, so that's what we know about him. What we should also know is that Shimi, the other character, was a close disciple of Abaye, of one of the 2. And when Abaye died, Shimi goes to study with a different disciple, with Rav Papa. So they're not at the same level. It's definitely a teacher-student relationship. So in other words, if both of them were students of Abaye, then the fact that one is to go study under the other one tells us that Papa was more advanced. And the other thing that's important is to note is that this is usually a very intense relationship. This was also meant to be about guidance about their lives, and it was a very intimate relationship. It wasn't just like go to school, take notes, go home. So this is not an ordinary like, well, maybe the teacher doesn't know you that well. This is an intimacy and a rigor of study and relationships that are important. That's the backstory. If anybody has questions at any time, you should definitely hold up your hand or just take yourself off mute. I don't want to, I don't want to talk over something that isn't fully understood. So those are our characters. So he was frequently before Rav Papa means he was studying where Rav Papa was. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so so here we have, so this is the next piece. Rav Shimi Bar Ashi was frequently before Rav Papa. We just did that line, and now it continues with, and he was makshe, him, Rav Papa, a great deal. Now I specifically didn't translate makshe because we need to understand what it is. It's not just, it's not simple. But whatever it is, he was frequently with Rav Papa, and he did this a lot. Okay, this is behavior that just continues. Now, you should know, makshe is not a bad thing. In fact, most of traditional Jewish text study is based on that. It's a kind of challenging, a kind of questioning that is really at the core of traditional study. It's how you learn, it's how you do things. And it means both to ask questions, but also to dispute. But again, disputing is not a bad thing. It's actually part of the process. So in this text where it says that, he used to ask many difficult questions is probably one way to translate it, but it's the norm. So we're a little bit like, okay, so he did, is that a problem? What do you think about if you had a student in whatever setting who asked a lot of questions all the time? Even if you had a classroom or a situation where you were welcoming questions, could you imagine a situation where that might be a bit much, or you might feel, I don't know, let's find out how he handles it, or how it is received, let's just say. What's interesting is that it reminded me of the word objectionable in English, which is, it's a play, it works both ways, right? So objectionable both means to make an objection, which is nothing wrong with it, but it also could mean a not okay way of doing something. So makshe holds that too. It's both okay, it's just questioning, or it can have an edge that is not acceptable in some way. So sort of keep that in mind as we look at what happens next. Okay, Dini, do you mind the next slide? So that was the first line. Now we're ready for the second line. This is the first half of the second line. It says one day. Now, I will tell you, every time it says one day in the Talmud, you should brace yourself. It is never one day. As soon as it says that, just be sure something is going to change in what is a regular situation. So they're always together. He asks all these questions. This is the day where something is going to change, usually for the worse. Something bad is about to happen. So one day, not one day. Okay, so here we are. Oh, we know this. So now we're like, oh, one day, uh-oh. He, Rav Shimi, found him, Rav Papa, on his face. Now, on his face is a particular practice that is still part of traditional liturgy today. It's called tachanun. You may be familiar with it. But tachanun is essentially a very private confessional prayer that is offered during the week for the most part, and not said on Shabbat, although we don't call Shabbat the day we remember tachanun, just being clear. And tachanun today is done, if you can see me, tachanun is done usually with your non-dominant hand. So for me, it's my left hand. And the same way you might know how like during the Shema, many people cover their eyes. In tachanun, you take your non-dominant hand and you hold it over your face and you sort of bend down into your lap. And it gives you this, it's sort of like tilting your screen down. It gives you privacy. And that's because you are actually confessing to very real things. In those days, it was done more dramatically, which was that he actually went down on the floor and put his face and had his whole face down. But I want to just say the analogy is, it's like being in therapy. If you walked by and saw someone in therapy or heard their voices, everybody knows you just keep walking. Well, Dini, next slide. What happens here? He sees him on his face and he hears Papa say, Merciful one, save me from the humiliation of Shimmy. So A, he should never have stayed long enough to have heard that. B, what in the world does this mean? How could this, this is a real question. How could this be read in two different ways? Merciful one, save me from the humiliation of Shimmy. What is the humiliation of Shimmy? They're two totally different ways of reading it. They're both correct, so.
That he might humiliate Shimmy for being not smart enough in some aspect of teaching him. That he himself would humiliate Shimmy.
Great. So now there are three ways. That is absolutely possible, which is like, he's like, I want to do something with Shimmy, but I don't want to humiliate him. Please help me, save me from this dilemma. Terrific. That's one of three. There are two others. What else could this mean?
Shimmy might humiliate him by asking him a question that he can't respond to.
Exactly. Maybe all this mock-shaying is actually making Papa uncomfortable. He's making him feel stupid. He's like, he's asking me these questions in front of everybody and I don't actually know the answer. Please save me from this. I am humiliated. Great. That's two possibilities. What's one more? How about from Shimmy's, what if he, yeah, the other way. The first two are about Papa. That Shimmy would be humiliating himself. Save me from having a student who is making a fool of himself or who's making himself seem, doing something that is just not right. And, you know, I need help. Probably other possibilities too. One of the things that's very, very important about this story, and you see because I've had to put in a lot of brackets, is there are very ambiguous pronouns and every statement can be read multiple ways. And like I said, it's a tight literary unit. Part of why that is there is because this is a story about unclear communication. Ambiguity in communication is told in an ambiguous way. It's one of the reasons it just holds its own so beautifully, but also is very confusing. So there are many ways to read this. So this is what he says. Shimmy overhears him. And what does he do? Well, before we turn to what does he do, what should he do? Now what? You have overheard, you know, your great teacher in therapy saying, oh my God, please save me from this student, the humiliation of this student. What is the correct response? There's only one. What should you do? What would you do?
Pretend he didn't hear it.
Okay.
Walk away.
Did somebody say no way? I would love to hear.
Walk away.
Walk away. Right. So first of all, he should never have heard. But honestly, that's a pretty short statement. So, I mean, it could be, but I have to say this was whispered. I mean, this is one of the most intimate interactions with God. This was not like, save me from Shimmy. This was like whispered. So it's a little suspicious that he, you know, he wanted to hear on some level. This was some level of overhearing, whether maybe it wasn't fully conscious, but he heard it. So walk away and then go to Papa and say, either admit what you heard and then ask how to handle it, or a white lie and just be like, I've been wondering if maybe you thought God should save you from me. No, I mean, somehow actually try to figure out, what did he mean by this? It's not clear. So at least, and this is, I think, one of the biggest points about, in general, overhearing things, is that we make a lot of assumptions in general about what people mean, and we don't clarify. We go on with what we think. Now, what he thinks may be a projection from, well, let's find out. Dini, do you mind going to the next slide? This is our last line. So his response is, he took it upon himself, he made a vow to be silent, and he never mockshed him again. What kind of ending to, that's the end of the story. What just happened here? What is the actual tragedy of this? Who is being criticized here as the rabbis of the Talmud were writing this? What is happening? Somebody.
He silenced him, therefore losing the gift of what the student had to offer.
Okay, so one is, I think the thing I would object to is he silenced him. If he did, it was because that's how Shimmy understood it.
That's how Shimmy understood.
Right, but great. I mean, Papa could have said, look, you got to stop. That would be different. But so just nuance of what you were saying, but you're right. This is it. This is what silenced him. He's like, okay, then I just won't do it anymore. What's the problem with a student? Oh, this is not meant to accuse any of you, but what is the problem with a student who doesn't speak? We need students to speak. We need people to speak up and share things.
Well, he didn't just not speak. He was really being vengeful about it. For all of us who teach, and we have students who speak all the time, rather than sort of dealing with it as an issue in the class, once you criticize them, they'll never speak again, and they'll sit there silently and speaking a lot while being silent.
Exactly.
That's right.
And I can imagine Shimmy that way, can't you? Sort of just, he still sticks around, but he's not going to talk. Great. It's great. What else? Other ideas? I heard another voice starting to come in. I do see in the chat, Wendy, whose microphone isn't working, said, Shimmy felt judged and was silenced. Shimmy wasn't able to clarify and understand what was being taught, right? That's the tragedy, right? He could actually have clarified, or the thing about clarification is you might get an answer you don't like. It's not that it gets clarified and it's what you thought. How much of this is just about him making assumptions about what he heard and, just handling it on his own? And a student who can't ask questions or who isn't engaged, as Dina was saying, that's not a student anymore. But also, who is a teacher who doesn't ask and clarify? I mean, this is on Papa. Like, why doesn't he say, Shimmy, I've noticed you've been really quiet lately, especially because he used to be so loud. So now think about that for a minute. What is Papa, why wouldn't Papa confront him? Let's not, it's not about being generous. He's human. Why would he see this Shimmy, who has been giving him a hard time, see him be quiet and leave it alone? Why? There are a couple ideas. What do you think? Go psychological.
The Machaya, he doesn't have anybody bothering him anymore.
He's relieved. I mean, I've felt that, where I just don't even want to know. I just am so glad that whatever was troubling is just gone, that I'm relieved. So partly this is on Papa. Like, this is a story that is criticizing both of them for different reasons. The other possibility is, and this is also apropos of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and this is a theological issue, is, do you think that Papa thought God answered him in the affirmative? Right? He got what he wanted. He said, please save me from the humiliation of Shimmy. And then it happens. Does he think God was like, okay, I'm going to get Shimmy to not say anything? God answered him. He got what he wanted. But did God answer him? The triangulation with God in this story is very problematic. It's very problematic. And yes, there are theological differences. There are people who certainly believe that God intervenes, oh boy, in the world in this way. But this is an important question around the high holidays. We do a lot of this kind of praying, bless us with this, save us from that, Do we think God is in the world? Is God actually doing those things? Again, we're not going to unpack the variety of theological positions on this, but this story definitely is ambiguous about what it means to think that God has answered your prayers. Literally, figuratively, was God even there? Was this all about Shimmy? I mean, there's something there that is like the rest of the story. It's just ambiguous.
But Rach, couldn't this also be a warning? Careful what you pray for?
Exactly. Be careful what you pray for.
Yes. But so say why? What's the problem? So he got what he wanted. Why? What's the problem?
What he wanted, but as others have already said, there's a profound loss that comes from him getting what he wanted in the interactions that yield new insights and wisdom between a teacher and a student.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely.
And teaching someone who never questions is not fun. I mean, the good in teaching is the back and forth.
Right. Certainly essential to Jewish study.
Wonderful to teach and have no one there. It's like teaching empty space.
Which, some of the pre-recorded Zoom lectures, I have to say, feel like that. But you're absolutely right. The give and take is essential to some extent. So in fact, they have killed Jewish study here. This is it. Nothing is alive here anymore. Nothing. Papa isn't teaching, Shimmy isn't learning, and all because of what?
And also, what did the other students learn in this interaction?
Thank you. Exactly. How come nobody's going over to Shimmy and being like, you've been very quiet in class recently? This is what a healthy learning environment is supposed to be, is one where it's not just about your head, but it's about your heart and your hands. And when you notice that somebody is off, if it's appropriate, you find a way to check in, explicitly, not explicitly. I had a student the other night who is normally very boisterous and fun and delightful, and he was sitting on the Zoom call like this. His face was away, and he looked angry. And I was totally aware of it the whole time, and I was really worried. And I was worried that I'd said something that upset, again, like take it personally, right? One of the best pieces of wisdom ever that my mother offered me was take it seriously, but not personally. And I live by that. Well, I try to live by that. She said she learned that from raising me, so just saying. But it's a really important principle, which is take it seriously. Like, I'm gonna find out, but it wasn't personal. His son had gotten engaged the night before, and he was exhausted. He was up all night. So first of all, not only did I worry that it was about me, right? But I was also worried that he was upset and angry. Like, I'm just reading all this into it, and I could have been Shimmy. I could have looked at it and been like, wow, okay, wow, I guess I wonder what I did. I could stew and wonder and play out different scenarios. No, really, I could. And instead, I just checked in with him, and I was like, be okay. And he was like, oh, I'm great. I was like, uh-huh. And then he told me, and I was like, oh my God, you are great. That's wonderful. That is mazal tov. That's so exciting. And the relief that I felt was actually parallel to the relief that Papa felt. It wasn't the relief of it went away. It's the relief of clarification. And if he had told me he was terrible or that I had offended him, at least I could know what was going on from his perspective. And then there's a possibility of tshuva. There's a possibility of repair. Doesn't mean it works. One of the things I love about our tradition is that, it's not turn the other cheek, or it's not, don't worry if it's terrible. No, if it's bad, it's bad. Like, let's deal with it. It's not, sweep it away because we don't like it. Like, this is actually about confronting who we are and our best selves and our worst selves, and working. It's just a lot of work. So this is a story where work wasn't really done. So let's see. I want to go to the next slide. Don't go yet. I'm not sure.
I just want to say one more thing about Shimmy.
Yeah, please.
Once again, taking the classroom as he actually became probably a lot more powerful in his silence than when he was talking all the time. Because for all of us, there's always that one student that you feel is sitting there and judging, and it's usually the silent one, not the talkative one.
That is so interesting. That's really interesting. So I wonder, actually play that out for a minute. Then what is happening to Papa if that's how he's perceiving Shimmy? That's a different read. That's interesting. He's not relieved, that's for sure.
I mean, if it was me, I would just feel it like a bad teacher.
Yeah.
And self-conscious because he really knew that Rav Papa was worried, had his own concerns about him. So it was some sort of a different dynamic that never got addressed emotionally.
Yeah.
He doesn't like me. He hates me.
Like me. Right. And, I think it's very, very human, which is why I think this is a great story, because it allows everyone to be ambiguously human. I mean, Papa just seems to not want to deal with it. He either, as Dina was saying, he's just feeling bad about himself as a teacher, which seems actually like similar to what started the whole story, which was something makes him uncomfortable about what Shimmy is doing, and he just doesn't want to confront it. So even if he has some relief, this is a failure all around. And where are the other students? I mean, everyone had to have noticed this, right? Why is this how it's allowed to be left? Other thoughts?
I don't want to talk too much.
Oh, it's wonderful.
But there's always one student who matters very much, even in a sea of students, having taught for many years. I think there are often, there's like a catalyst student or a, you know, and that is a different quality of it within the class as a whole. Even if a teacher never admits it, there are certain students that keep the thing going. So I don't think it's necessary, because the prayer was about Shimmy. The others probably were, it was fine. And we don't know if any of the other students took it upon themselves to talk to Shimmy either.
Yeah, I mean, part of, again, it doesn't say, because
it's not really relevant.
Not relevant, I think, because it's not the point, right? And yet, you know, as readers, I mean, this is like how you do midrash on midrash. Like, I do want to know what was happening in that classroom. I can picture that classroom. I can, and I can think about, like, you know, sending little crumpled up notes. Although I think now everybody just texts each other during class before my time. But we used to send little notes like, you know, look at Shimmy. What's up with him? You know, like, is anybody doing that? You know, we don't know, but we could maybe imagine. And I love people bringing in their own experience as teachers, is that, yeah, I mean, there's things that are familiar about this. And what I appreciate about what you're saying, Renee, is that you're saying a difficult truth, which is parallel to when people have conversations about favorite children, which is not that a child is always a favorite, but many parents are aware that they have a certain kind of feeling towards one child for some amount of time. And it's a horrible thing to admit. And yet the Torah is full of those stories, precisely because it feels like an ugly feeling, and yet it is completely normal. And so how do we balance that? We don't say it's normal, so it's okay. We say, well, what are the results of that? Like, what are the consequences of what is completely reasonable and normal and not necessarily terrible? And yet, you know, and this is a similar story, right? Like in that same way, this is behavior that we can recognize, and it doesn't mean that it's fine. It means that this text is giving us an opportunity to untangle some of the things about it that can feel real to us. It does make us question. We might, as you said, recognize ourselves in this story. And at the same time, you know, it challenges us to think about, you know, even not in a teaching session, just to think about, what is it to overhear something? You know, how often do we make assumptions about what we hear?
Rachel, can I?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to delay you if there's, you know, if you want to get to another section.
No, go ahead.
So you introduced the text study after sharing time with us, focusing on the lingering sounds in our minds and in our hearts. And you think about Rosh Hashanah, and the stories that we read on Rosh Hashanah, and the conversations that we read about having transpired, and then the silence that exists forever after between those two people. So I'm thinking about, you know, is the last thing that Hagar ever heard Sarah say or overhear her say is, you know, Garesh ha'ama hazot, right? Like, get rid of that maidservant. Is the last thing that Avraham ever heard his son Yitzchak say, because they never talked to each other again after the Akedah, is, you know, Ayeh Haset, like, where's the animal that you're going to be, and how that might have haunted Avraham. And I keep thinking about, I think it was the Kotzker Rebbe who said that, it was some Hasidic Rebbe said that we all have only a finite number of words to utter during the course of our lifetime. And once you utter all the words that you have been placed on this earth to say, you will die. So the challenge that this Rebbe said is, make sure that every word that comes out of your mouth is a word of value and a word of warmth and a word of goodness, because chalila, that the last words out of your mouth before you die are, you idiot. Right? You don't want that to be your, right? If you use up all your words by speaking harshly, that's what people's echoes will be of you.
And it makes me think of actually something that changed for me very dramatically, which is I used to be very self-righteous or very much a stickler for not saying I love you when I didn't sort of mean it. That very casual, like, oh, I love you. I just was like, that's just silly. I don't understand that. It's just like, it doesn't mean anything. And I don't know, it's just very stuck on that. And I felt very, I don't know, self-righteous, I think, and thinking like, well, I didn't throw it around. And then a friend of ours, their son died. And she, during Shiva, said the last thing he said to me was, I love you. And we asked about the context. And I was thinking, well, it must have been some beautiful conversation. She said, no, we all end every conversation with each other like that. And I thought, oh my God, what have I been doing? Like, why am I stingy with this? Why do I have to stand on my high horse? And now I do it too. And I think about it a lot. I don't still totally feel comfortable, but it made me realize that actually, yes, the last thing you say to somebody and you never know. And I don't think it's great to walk around like that all the time, but I do think, and this is, part of what I wanted to share towards the end also, is that I think the best book I have read about speech is Joseph Telushkin's Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. That book has withstood the test of time. I assign it all the time. It is the most readable, interesting. It's just a fantastic book. And it really takes you through all these issues about speech. And he's just a good writer. He's a good popularizer and captures great anecdotes. And it's not long, but it's really thorough actually. And, he ends, so it's all these, criticism and gossip and, he goes through all these things. And then the last chapter are Words That Heal. And that chapter had a big impact on me, and it fits with what Dini was just saying, which is he basically was like, there are only a few things that people really need to hear, and we don't say them enough. And in many ways, I think that he's describing the silence or the memory of sound. We do tend to remember the negative stuff, but he really makes a case for saying certain things more often than we do. And to people we might, basically it's a little bit like one of the ways that people talk about regular prayer is not that it is meaningful every time, but that it keeps the connection open. It allows you to keep going and say it until you mean it, which again, not everybody appreciates, but there is something about the habit of telling people I love you, or telling people, I miss you, or I'm sorry, or, I'm here if you need me, or whatever, there are just certain basic things that acknowledge other people in this world. And I don't know, to me, it feels like, and this is just my experience of it, is I experience it as stinginess. And I think of myself as actually a very generous person, but it's been work for me to sort of try to remember that I don't have to feel it so deeply or have it be this momentous occasion. I just need to say the things that are true, even if I don't feel them in that moment, just more often. And so apropos of the Kotzker Rebbe and how many words you have, I don't know how well I would do to sort of, or I actually do know how well, which is not well, how well I would do to, hold back on some of the ways I waste words. But I certainly, could and have been trying to actually at least counter that with more of the positive words. And again, like, better that than not doing, than trying really hard. I mean, every year I will not gossip again. I will try so hard, and literally by the break the fast. I mean, it's classic and it's upsetting to me. And yet that's a struggle, but I'm going to, I've committed to struggling more with also at the same time, at least trying to work on being more expressive of things I genuinely feel. So I think there's something in that too that is important about how many words we have and what we do with them. And I think the high holidays have us focus a lot on the ways in which we misuse our gifts and resources. I'm teaching a class right now on the body, and we were looking at all the al-chaitz, that's long 43 during Yom Kippur, 43 separate actions that we say in the collective, for the sin of. 11 of the 43 are about speech. That's not a coincidence. It's huge. and actually, I think another 25 or so are the other parts of the body. So I challenged my students to actually go into Yom Kippur this year and say, okay, for each time you mention a part of a body and how it has helped you stray, can you counter that with a way that either you have or you will use that same part of the body to do good? Not as a way of, repairing what you did wrong, but just as a way, again, of putting more positivity and more, not just always focused on how we're broken and wrong. That's a critical piece, but also just actually taking that additional step. It's like by omission and commission, like not just what we're not going to do, but what are we going to do? And so I feel that way a little bit about this idea of Yom Zichron Truah, that if we're not going to blow shofar, we might just be like, okay, we're not going to blow shofar. That's a bummer about Shabbat or whatever. But actually, I think it's close to what Dini was saying before, which is like, maybe we should be remembering this for other reasons, for what it symbolizes, for what it prompts in us, what it provokes. And that, whether or not we can actually hear it, can we replace some of the things some of the sounds, some of the voices, some of the things that reverberate that are ugly inside of us, that are criticisms, that were humiliations. Is there a way to at least add in or allow the shofar to take us to that place and work on it in some way? So I want to go to the last slide. This is the last one, which basically is very similar to what I just said, but in more succinct terms. So this is the idea of Yom Zichron Truah as sort of like a challenge to ourselves. What if we took the time to remember sounds we cannot hear, but that nevertheless reverberate in our psyches as resentments, disappointments, and humiliation? And what if we paid attention to the ways we neglect to ask clarifying questions, not bother to assume positive intent, or find the humility that allows us to be open and vulnerable with people in our lives? What if that is just one way of thinking about Yom Zichron Truah, whether or not you actually hear the shofar that day or not, which many of you will, which is wonderful. But maybe other days, to just sort of wonder, what is that silence prodding us to do? What is the memory of sound, but not the sound itself, having us think about? So before we conclude with a wish, a bracha for the coming year, I would love to know if people have additional comments or questions or anything you want to add. I would really love to hear from any of you.
You've generated the silence.
I know, it's a little worrisome. But you know what? Edith's going to blow a shofar, so that should make it okay. She is, actually.
Can I stop the screen share, Rachel, or should I?
No, because let's do the very last piece, and then yes. So this really is my bracha for all of us. It is certainly a strange year. I have to say, Shana Tova, I used to think Shana Tova was just sort of like, it's so parav, have a good year. A good year, like that's the best I'm hoping for. Honestly, this year, I'll take a Shana Tova. I'm just like, please, just minimally fine. It would be great. So in thinking about that, I really hope that the sound of the shofar, as well as the silence of the shofar, bring us closer to becoming our best selves. And wishing all of you a Shana Tova, Tikatenu v'Tichatenu, and with a little nod to pop culture, may we be signed, sealed, and delivered into a good year, really, for all of us and for the whole world, honestly. On our wounded coasts. It's been a pleasure, and I really thank Dini for this opportunity. And it's lovely to see familiar faces and to get a chance to hear from some of ones I don't know. So that's it. Thanks. And Dini is going to blow the shofar.
I am. Rachel, let me just stop sharing for a moment. There we are. Thank you so much for bringing your Torah to my community. I knew that we would learn a lot. I knew we would laugh a lot. I knew that you'd make us think and make us feel. And you've given us a great gift to take into Yom Tov. So we will think not only about what the absence perhaps of the shofar from time to time can mean, but hopefully we'll carry the absence of your voice within us as presence of what we ought to be thinking about and wrestling with. So I am going to lead us in Kaddish Rabbanan, as I always do after we study text, and then we will close our session together with the blowing of the shofar, as is customary to do during this month of Elul. Most often it's blown in the morning, but if you haven't heard it, there's certainly no barrier to hearing it at night. If it's your custom to stand for Kaddish, I invite you to. Otherwise, please just pay attention to the shofar and to the Kaddish. You can unmute yourselves if you'd like to respond to the Kaddish. Gadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
Ve'omad divrach yiroteh v'yamlich malchuteh b'chayechon u'v'yameichon u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam olam me'el maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithatar v'yit'aleh v'yit'alal shemei kudusha b'richu le'ila min kol berchata v'shirata tishbechata v'nechamata damiran be'olma v'imru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidehon v'al kol Tamidehon v'al kol man de'oskin be'oraita diva atra hadein v'diva chol atar v'atar yehe lehon u'lechon shlama rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin u'mazana revicha u'for konamin kodam avuhon libishmaya v'imru amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imramav u'barachamav ya'aseh shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen.
Amen.
Laila Tov, everyone.
Laila
Tova. Before you go, sorry everyone, before you go, please know everyone is welcome to our High Holy Day services at Shar. We'll be live streaming on our website, on our Facebook page. No access code needed. Everyone is welcome. There are no ticket fees, no charges. Please join us this coming Monday night on Ground Waves, where we'll welcome as our guest Rabbi Dayan Daniel Siegel, who is the first Musmach, the first ordinee of Reb Zalman, and who will be talking to us about the role of our relationship to the earth and to nature in our process of tshuva and of seeking forgiveness. Next Wednesday night, while our Elul Shiur series will be over, we will continue to study as we do every Wednesday night at Shar in our Batei Midrash that we convene in our study programs. Next Wednesday night will be the first of 3 Wednesdays that we are devoting to looking deeply at the questions raised for us by the pandemic. Next Wednesday night, in preparation for Yom Kippur, we will look at the issue of mortality through the lens of the prayer of the Unatan HaTokef. So please join us. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone. Laila Tov and Shana Tova, at least.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Rachel. Rachel, you're the best.
Excuse me? Pardon?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're the best too. There's 2 best.
Laila Tov, everyone.
A wonderful evening.